going on, Macro Mob family? I'm Sean. My co-host is Damien. And if you didn't know, now you know. We're completely unqualified and uninterested in providing you with financial, social, legal, and life advice. Today, with all the conflicts that are going around the world, there's been a discussion popping up whether we should keep moving towards renewable resources, biofuels, in order to fill up our tanks or to provide that necessary energy, or because of these conflicts, should we get rid of biofuels because in the short term, it's taken away from the ability to be able to feed countries and people who are underserved or who could possibly run into food shortages or famine. So today, Dame's going to present you with some interesting points. This is something that you can find in the news, and it'll probably start to grow in your news feeds, and it's something that you should keep track of. So go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, I came across some really interesting articles in this past week, really on two sides of the biofuel debate, and I thought it was interesting because we've been really looking at the conflict in Russia-Ukraine from different angles, but this is one that I didn't think about, but basically there's a current controversy around biofuels. There's sort of two sides to this argument. One is to temporarily at least remove the use of food crops to make biofuels. And those are called feedstocks is what they call them. Basically anything that you feed into the machine to turn into biofuel. But on the other hand, the biofuel industry has been stepping up its lobbying, using this as a time to push forward and say, hey, look, this is the perfect example of why we need to invest more and double down in ethanol, because oil prices can, go up at a moment's notice. So we've talked about some of these stats before, but we know that Ukraine and Russia combined account for a huge majority of the sunflower oil exports and the wheat exports. One thing we didn't really talk about when we did our show on oil, cooking oil, was that about a quarter of those edible oils that are made get turned into biofuels. So it doesn't all go to the kitchen. One of the stats I saw this week is that if you just took wheat out of the biofuel supply chain, it would offset about 20% of the collapsed Ukrainian wheat exports. So just shutting off the tap for wheat could be the difference between hunger or not for some people. There's this nonprofit out of Brussels called the Transport and Environment Organization, TNE, and they basically show that 10,000 tons of wheat is the equivalent of 15 million loaves of bread, and that's what is turned into ethanol in Europe, on a kind of regular basis. So just really quickly, people can check this out for themselves, but when we talk about biofuels, it's a bunch of things. It's crops, sugarcane, corn. It's also oils and animal fats. I didn't know that. There's something called second generation biofuels, which is cellulose, so plant fibers, corn stalks, and the parts that we don't actually eat. And then the third generation is algae, and that is a growing part of the feedstock. In other words, you've probably seen these big tanks where they grow algae and it runs through pipes, and they turn that into biofuel. Yeah.
And where I live, we call them pools.
Pools, that's right, pools, yeah. They also use waste too. Most people probably driven past a trash mountain one time in their life. They bury over a lot of agricultural waste, including animal waste, and then throw things over it and pipe the methane or whatever out of the hill. The three main ones are corn-based ethanol, soy-based diesel, and palm oil biodiesel. Those are really what ends up into vehicles. Ethanol is the most widely used. Most cars today can use about a 10% ethanol blend. So it's not, we just don't have a whole bunch of cars running around on pure ethanol. But the idea is over time, if each car was using about 10% of that, and you see it at the pump, that should have an effect. The United States has, this statistic is actually a few years old, but we've got over 2,300 E85 fueling stations. So that's a higher concentration of ethanol that is used in certain vehicles. The US is the biggest, I think one of the biggest ethanol producers. Brazil is also huge. For the US, it's 16 billion gallons approximately. Most of that's ethanol and a little bit of biodiesel. Biofuel has been sold as a petroleum replacement, but it's not exactly that. The selling points are that it's renewable, and renewable in the sense that you can grow more, okay? And theoretically, you could do that forever, right? Biofuel does pollute. The difference is they use something called the GHG emission life cycle. And so basically, when you're producing some petroleum product, turning it into gas for your car, there's a life cycle of how that pollutes the air and the planet. So ethanol will do the same thing, but over a 30-year period, the emissions are less than what it would be if you were using petroleum. It's a very complicated thing. Ethanol does complete combustion, and so that when something is burned completely, that reduces the amount of carbon monoxide. So it's basically the difference between something burning up 100% or burning and leaving a lot of byproducts. A lot of feedstocks with agriculture today can be produced on less and less land. Now, of course, you need more and more fertilizer. That's another issue. Obviously, fertilizer out of Ukraine and Russia is at a premium. With the waste, you don't have to produce anything. It's already there. Sometimes it's turned into fertilizer. Sometimes it's fed back to animals. Oftentimes it ends up in these things that I'm calling trash mountains. That is not an official term.
That's the technical term. Yes, it is.
Yeah. And then it's also sold as, hey, this is something we can produce domestically instead of relying on foreign inputs. And there's tons of subsidies for farmers. Anybody who knows the ethanol lobby is pretty strong during elections. What's the negative? As I said, it's not really this big environmental game changer. Okay. I've attached some links that go a bit more into the pollution that it causes in water and all of those things. But at the end of the day, it's not so much that it's reducing pollution. It's that the hope is that by relying more on ethanol, we import less petroleum and stop using non-renewable resources. So the environmental sales pitch is not as sexy as some of the other things that we use. So basically, if you're going to get a bang for your buck out of investing in biofuel, you have to increase biofuel production and reduce the production of fossil fuels. Okay, so it's an augment, not a replacement completely. The big negative that is being talked about a lot now is that when you put food stocks into biofuel, you're essentially removing it from human consumption. You're using land to produce food that's never getting eaten and not going into animal products either. So you could be taking more and more land for agriculture, using more and more water, but the supply of food is not increasing. And as the demand for biofuel starts putting more money in people's pockets, that could have an impact on food prices. And the same thing with the cellulose feedstocks, algae as well. It competes for these same products. Algae has to eat something. So you use fertilizer to do that. Again, water pollution, air quality could decline because, again, biofuels are not, just perfectly clean gas that when it burns. This effect on food prices is well known. This is not actually a new conversation. So there's been studies for years talking about, and these are well known to the government. So talking about if we increase the production of biofuels, it is going to have a impact on food prices. It's just part of the process. Now, there's some debate on how much it will affect prices. There's I didn't find any paper that really gives us a number, but some of that is because the biofuels are a growing industry, and it's also only now making it into other countries. Poorer countries are giving up their land for these producers. But there is a fear, and again, it's documented that the higher crop prices are to go to biofuels, that's going to cause even hunger and malnutrition. So, what's sort of the stumbling block with biofuels, and the balance between that and using it for food? Well, it's mandates. Okay, the U.S. has there was an Energy Policy Act of 2005. That's been updated by the Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007. Under that act, the goal is to expand what we call our renewable fuel standard to up biofuel production up to 36 billion gallons by this year. I think that's recently been amended. And then one of the goals down the road is that another 21 billion gallons of that comes from the cellulose or advanced biofuels. These mandates basically are much more complicated, but they lay out targets and goals and how much ethanol should be in our fuel. Europe has a famous one called the Renewable Energy Directive. That's mandates that at least 20% of all the energy usage in Europe or in the EU, okay, including at least 10% of energy in road fuels, has to come from renewable resources, okay, or renewable sources. Right now, they've got a target for renewable fuel of 32% renewable fuel target by 2030. However, only 14% of that, 14% use in the transport sector. Okay, so trucks and things really only have to meet a 14%. How do they really get there? They don't change the engine on the truck. They just hope that technology catches up so they can add a little bit more ethanol to the in your blend all the time. Okay, or your diesel, you get a bit more biodiesel in your diesel. There are other things that the governments do. Tax breaks, grants, subsidies are the big thing in the U.S., and then a lot of loans for research and development. So there's a lot of money to be made in that business. One thing that is really interesting is that in order to increase the production of biofuel, you need a whole bunch of land. So right now, Europe's biofuel consumption takes about 5% of all of Europe's farmland. That's enormous when you think about all the agricultural products that come out of Europe. It would take 10% of Europe's farmland today to just replace 7% of the oil they import from Russia. Okay? So to replace all of Russia's oil today, you would have to convert 80% of Europe's farmland. That's obviously not possible, but it gives you an idea of why these critics of biofuel are making some progress, because really what they're saying is we're not using a whole bunch of land we're not getting a bunch out of what we're using. So really we're getting more food than we're getting energy if we were to just transition the use. So there's this debate: is it immoral to keep pushing for biofuel and increase biofuel production right now when we're facing global food shortages? Again, as I said, these mandates, what they really mean is you get a small return for your money while the cost is high. And if you left that food, or assuming the food is edible, because we all know there's a lot of corn that's produced for corn syrup and you couldn't eat it. But assuming the food is edible, that would have a much bigger impact on food insecurity. It would also, as I said, it would reduce the pressure on wheat supplies, cooking oil supplies. Some of the things I found while looking at this topic is Japan recently announced that it expects its biofuel market to double over the next 15 years. And because, as we all know, Japan doesn't have access to a lot of resources, it is meeting with its restaurant people and its public, encouraging them to continue recycling it. And they're going to expand that program to try and offset imports of biofuel. There has been some talk that the Biden administration is considering a waiver of the nation's biofuel policy. I don't think that's going to happen, because we're around the corner from an election. But also the ethanol lobby has been very powerful for a long time. So the end of that sort of discussion is just, while we're facing a global crisis in many ways because of what's going on in Europe, if we're looking for solutions to keep people from going hungry in Egypt and Africa and all those places we talked about before, what's a quick way to do it? Well, if there's corn being grown in Europe or grain being grown in Europe that is edible, instead of converting that into fuel that isn't going to make the biggest impact in our tanks tomorrow. Do we have a moral obligation to slow production or stop it in order to feed people? I will also say, and we're going to link the article below, there's a big push in Washington now by the biofuel companies to really get more funding and to ramp up production. So this is the time that we're going to make a big decision, and it could affect not just people hunger and stability in the future, but right now. So that's why that was interesting to me.
Yeah, it's about finding that balance, because who's ever ultimately going to make the decisions, it won't be you, and definitely won't be me. They're going to have to decide, do we make decisions to take care of the problems that we can see right now that could possibly be catastrophic for developing nations when it comes to food, or do they stick to this long-term plan of trying to become carbon neutral and become renewable by 2050, right? Because that can be a goal, but we can't do it at the expense of people right now, would be my thought. But it'll be interesting to see kind of how this goes, because you have those opposing forces. People want to make money. They're going to lobby for it. That's going to be important for them. We already know that people have been buying up lots of farmland. Possibly, who knows? Maybe we could look up some information. Maybe some of the purchases that we've seen over the past 2 years of farmland are with this idea in mind of possibly using that acreage for more biofuels. So it's something to keep our eye on for sure.
Yeah, and I think too, it's one thing I didn't see in the articles was what you would normally think, right? You would normally think just the idea of biofuels. You'd see a lot of positivity from the environmental lobby, or from politicians who have been pushing, was the Green New Deal or some equivalent, but it's just crickets. And when you really look into biofuels, now algae may be different. These third generations may be different in terms of what they burn, but I don't think anybody's going to stand up and say, no, we have to push forward because it's really a much cleaner alternative. It's a renewable alternative, and that's important. But from a pollution standpoint, it's not, at least at this point, much better. So a lot of those traditional arguments don't fly. It really comes down to whether you want to be part of the solution for helping people eat or not.
Yeah, and some people feel differently about that.
Yeah.
So we're going to go ahead and wrap this episode up. If you enjoyed the episode, just show us some love. However you decide to do it, that's your preference. Whether it's watching another one of our videos, showing us some support, we'd really appreciate it. We'll catch y'all in the next episode. Take care.